Royal palaces have always been symbols of wealth, elegance, and absolute power. Their golden gates, polished marble floors, and glittering chandeliers told the world a story of refinement. But that was only the story the rulers wanted you to see. Behind those walls, a darker reality unfolded, one rarely written in official histories. Some of the king's most beloved companions were not glamorous noblewomen in the prime of their lives. They were barely out of childhood. Across centuries and continents, royalty used marriage and courtly romance not for love, but for control. Many of these so-called romances were nothing more than transactions, young girls given to kings, and emperors as offerings to secure political alliances, prevent wars, or simply feed the ruler's appetite for power and novelty. The ages would shock modern audiences. In many cases, the girls were 12, 13, or even younger. At that age, they were considered by their families and societies as bargaining chips, and by kings as possessions to be used, flaunted, and discarded. In royal culture, the youth of these girls wasn't hidden. It was celebrated. Their innocence was seen as a virtue, a symbol of purity and obedience. A child could not challenge a king. A child could not threaten his authority. And so, the practice became tradition, woven into the rituals of royal courts. In this episode of Dark History, we are re-pulling back the velvet curtain to reveal 5 cases from around the world where royal lovers were secretly children. These are not romantic love stories. They're stories of exploitation, dressed up as tradition. We'll travel from medieval Scotland to imperial China, from the Tudor court of England to the Ottoman Empire, and finally to the gilded salons of France. In each place, the pattern is disturbingly familiar. This is a story about power, about how innocence became a currency in the hands of kings, and about how history tried to erase the victims. Let us begin with number 5. The pious Scottish king, whose idea of peacekeeping meant taking a child into his bedchamber. The year was 1139. Scotland was a land divided, torn by rival clans whose feuds could last generations. At the center of it all stood King David I, a ruler remembered by official history as a saintly monarch, a lawgiver, and a man of deep piety. But buried beneath the flattering chronicles lies a story that challenges that image. The king had a problem. 2 of the most powerful clans in his realm were locked in a bitter blood feud. Raids burned villages to the ground. Retaliation was swift and merciless. The cycle threatened not only the clans themselves, but the stability of David's entire kingdom. The solution, at least in the eyes of the medieval court, was as old as monarchy itself: a marriage alliance. But this was not a marriage between equals. One clan offered up its most valuable gift to the king. Not gold, not land, but a child. She was just 12 years old. Her name does not appear in the records. She was simply referred to as the maid, as though her youth and anonymity were part of her value. She was taken from her family's stronghold, dressed in silks, far too heavy for her small frame, and paraded through the royal court as a symbol of peace. To the watching nobles, this was a political triumph. To the girl, it was an abduction wrapped in ceremony. She was too young to understand the complexities of clan politics. She only knew that she was now bound to a man nearly 4 times her age, the most powerful man in Scotland, and she could never return home. David's court chroniclers painted the arrangement as an act of unity, claiming it brought stability to the Highlands. They never questioned the cost to the child herself. In the 12th century, there was no such thing as consent for someone her age. Royal authority erased any moral objection. For the remainder of her short life, and records suggest it was short, she lived behind the thick stone walls of the king's castle. She attended feasts she could barely stomach, listened to political debates she couldn't follow, and was kept as both a political hostage and a personal possession. There are whispers in monastic writings that she grew ill and died before reaching full adulthood. If true, her death would have been seen not as a tragedy, but as an inconvenience, the loss of a political tool. The clans moved on, the king moved on, and history forgot her. Forgotten, except for a few lines in obscure charters and a shadow in the chronicles of King David's reign. This was the first in our list of royal lovers who were secretly children, and it sets the tone for the rest. Because as we move to number 4, we leave medieval Scotland for imperial China. where an emperor built an entire palace section dedicated to girls barely in their teens. The Tang Dynasty, 8th century China. This was the golden age of poetry, art, and culture, an era still celebrated in Chinese history as a pinnacle of refinement. At its heart stood Emperor Xuanzang, a ruler whose reign lasted more than 4 decades. He was a patron of the arts, a lover of music, and a man whose court glittered with elegance. But far from the public eye, behind the lacquered gates of the Forbidden City, Xuanzang maintained a secret that modern history books often soften or skip entirely. Within the imperial palace was a secluded section known to court insiders as a place where girls, some only 10 or 11 years old, were kept for the emperor's pleasure. This was not an occasional indulgence, it was a system. The girls were handpicked from wealthy and politically connected families. Their parents often presented them willingly, believing it was an honor to serve the emperor. The logic was cruel, but calculated. If your daughter became the emperor's favorite, your family's status would rise. You might receive land, money, or political appointments in return. The process was meticulous. Once chosen, the girls were taken from their homes, often without any real understanding of what awaited them. They entered the training halls, ornate rooms where older palace women taught them music, dance, and poetry. But these lessons were not for education in the modern sense. They were preparation to entertain, flatter, and please a man they had likely never met. Xuanzang himself was known for his love of beauty and youth. Court records describe him surrounding himself with fresh flowers, a euphemism for young girls. While official historians of the Tang Dynasty often praise this as a mark of imperial glory, it was in reality state-sanctioned grooming. The palace was a gilded prison. Girls could not leave without permission. They were guarded day and night by eunuchs, whose loyalty was to the emperor alone. Letters to their families were censored or never sent, and if a girl fell out of favor, she was quietly married off to a low-ranking official, a move that ensured she could never speak openly about what she had seen or experienced. The emperor's most famous companion, Yang Yifei, entered the palace at around 14, older than many of the girls kept there. Even she, one of the most celebrated beauties in Chinese history, lived under constant surveillance and political pressure. For the youngest, life in the palace was a slow erasure of identity. They were renamed, redressed, and reshaped into idealized figures who existed for one man's amusement. When Xuanzang's reign finally crumbled after the An Lashan rebellion, much of his opulence disappeared with him. But the system he had used, the recruitment of child concubines, had already been normalized in Chinese imperial culture. It would continue for centuries, long after his death. From China's Palace of Innocence, we now move to Tudor England, where the most famous king in British history surrounded himself with wives and mistresses, some of whom were barely into their teens when he first noticed them. When people think of Henry VIII, they imagine a larger-than-life king, famous for his 6 wives, his break with the Catholic Church, and his ruthless temper. The Tudor court has been romanticized in television dramas and paintings, glittering banquets, elegant gowns, and cunning political maneuvering. But hidden beneath the official histories is a disturbing reality. Henry's romantic interests didn't always begin with women. Sometimes they began with girls. In the Tudor period, it was common for noble families to send their daughters to court at a young age. The idea was simple. A young lady-in-waiting could serve a queen, learn courtly manners, and, if fortune smiled, attract the attention of a wealthy nobleman or even the king himself. For the family, this was an investment in status. For the girls, it was often a gilded trap. Some of these girls were barely 14 when they entered service. While Henry's wives are well documented, his flirtations and favors towards certain ladies-in-waiting were kept more discreet, mentioned only in letters, ambassador reports, and gossip. One example comes from a letter written by the Spanish ambassador, Eustace Chapais, who noted the king's fondness for a young maid in the queen's household. She was described as pretty, witty, and newly arrived, which suggests she was young, possibly no older than 15. Within months, she was receiving expensive gifts, jeweled brooches, fine fabrics, and invitations to private entertainments. Life at court for these young women was a dangerous balancing act. Catching the king's eye could bring rewards for your family, land, money, positions of power, but it also made you a target for rivals. Other courtiers whispered, plotted, and spread rumors. If the king grew bored, you could be dismissed in disgrace. One girl, whose name history barely preserved, vanished from court records entirely after a year of royal favor. No marriage was recorded, no later life mentioned. She simply disappeared from the written history, as if she had never existed. Henry himself never saw this behavior as scandalous. In the 16th century, the legal age of consent for girls in England was 12. While marriages at that age were less common among ordinary people, the aristocracy, and especially royalty, followed its own rules. The king was the law. This darker side of Tudor romance is often lost in the grand narratives of Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and Catherine Howard. But Catherine Howard's story itself is telling. She was only around 15 when she caught Henry's attention and about 17 when they married, an age that today would still be considered alarmingly young for a relationship with a man in his late 40s. Behind the pageantry and portraits, the Tudor court was a place where youth and beauty were currency, and where a girl's age was no barrier to the desires of a king. From the English throne, we now turn east once more, to the Ottoman Empire, where Sultan Murad III kept a harem filled with women and girls who had not yet reached their teenage years. The year was 1574. The Ottoman Empire was at the height of its power, stretching from Eastern Europe to North Africa, ruling over millions. At its center was the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a vast complex of marble courtyards, domed chambers, and intricately tiled halls. But the most secretive section of the palace was the imperial harem, a place surrounded by myth, rumor, and fear. The harem was more than a collection of the sultan's wives and concubines. It was a political institution. The women inside could influence imperial policy, control alliances, and even determine who would become the next sultan. But for many of its inhabitants, it was also a prison, one they entered as children. Sultan Murad III, who ruled from 1574 to 1595, was notorious for the size of his harem. Contemporary sources claim it housed hundreds of women, many of whom were taken from across the empire's vast territories, the Balkans, Circassia, Persia, and beyond. While some were in their late teens or 20s, records indicate that girls as young as 9 were brought into the palace. The recruitment process was brutal. Some were captured in raids and slave markets, others were gifted to the sultan by governors hoping to curry favor. Wealthy families in the empire sometimes offered their daughters voluntarily, believing that placement in the harem could secure wealth and political advancement. Once inside, the youngest girls were placed in the care of older concubines, who trained them in music, dance, court etiquette, and conversation. They were taught to walk with grace, to speak only when addressed, and to flatter without appearing insincere. This education was not designed to prepare them for freedom. It was meant to mold them into perfect servants of the sultan's pleasure and politics. Murad III was known for his insatiable appetite for companionship. Historical accounts suggest he fathered over 100 children, a number possible only through the continual rotation of concubines in his favor. For the youngest, this meant they were often noticed by the sultan before they had even reached maturity. The outside world romanticized the harem as a place of luxury: silk cushions, gold-threaded gowns, and exotic perfumes. But the reality was far from a dream. The women could not leave without permission. Every move was watched by eunuch guards loyal only to the sultan. Rivalries were fierce. Jealousy and politics created a constant undercurrent of danger. Those who fell out of favor might be married off to distant officials, sent to provincial palaces, or left to live in obscurity within the harem walls. Very few ever returned to the families they had been taken from. Murad's reign ended in 1595, but the system he maintained endured for centuries. The harem would remain an institution of both immense political influence and deeply hidden exploitation, a paradox that still shapes how history remembers the Ottoman Empire. From the domed chambers of Istanbul, our final case takes us to the glittering court of France, where Louis XV kept a secret house filled with young girls, hidden away from the eyes of Versailles. The year was 1745. Versailles was the center of French power, a palace so grand it seemed to float above reality. Louis XV, known as Louis the Beloved in his early reign, was still celebrated as a refined, handsome king. But by his middle years, his public image had changed. Gossip whispered through the gilded halls that the king's appetites were not only insatiable, they were dangerous. The most disturbing manifestation of those appetites was a place known as the Parc Cerfs, the Stag Park. On the surface, the Parc Cerfs was simply a quiet house in Versailles, away from the main palace. But its real purpose was hidden from public view. It served as a private residence for a rotating group of young girls kept for the king's sexual pleasure. Louis did not personally scout these girls. Instead, trusted intermediaries, notably his official mistress, Madame de Pompadour, oversaw their selection. Doors were usually between 14 and 16, though some accounts suggest they could be even younger. They were chosen for their beauty, obedience, and, most disturbingly, their freshness, a term used by courtiers as a polite mask for youth. Most came from poor or lower middle-class families. To these families, the offer was framed as an opportunity. Their daughters would live in comfort, see fine clothes, and perhaps secure a marriage settlement after their time with the king. What was left unsaid was that they would be removed from their homes, cut off from their previous lives, and placed entirely at the mercy of royal desires. Inside the Parc Cerfs, the girls lived in isolation. They had maids, tutors, and a physician, but almost no freedom. They were summoned to the palace when the king desired company, often without warning. For the rest of the time, they were expected to stay out of sight. The king's secret was to remain exactly that, a secret. Louis XV's use of the Parc Cerfs was not widely known by the French public during his lifetime. But rumors did spread among the nobility and foreign diplomats. Some accounts describe as many as a dozen girls being kept there at one time, with regular turnover to ensure the king's preferences were met. When a girl's time at the park ended, she was often given a small dowry, and quietly married off to a man of suitable but not too high rank. This ensured she would not return to high society with a platform to speak against the king. The whole arrangement was a carefully constructed machine, one designed to protect the monarch's reputation while normalizing the exploitation of children as part of royal privilege. By the end of Louis XV's reign, the Parc Cerfs had become a symbol of the monarchy's moral decay. It was one of the many factors that fueled public resentment toward the crown, resentment that would eventually explode into the French Revolution. And so, from medieval Scotland to the salons of Versailles, the pattern repeats. Power used to erase consent. Youth treated as a commodity, and history rewritten to soften the truth. Royalty, throughout history, has been painted in gold leaf. Grand portraits, lavish banquets, marble palaces were told about the romance, the power struggles, the wars, the treaties. But rarely do we see the truth that hid behind the silks and jewels, a truth where children were used as currency, traded between families and rulers to secure status, influence, or pleasure. In every one of these cases, the exploitation was not only tolerated, it was normalized. Entire systems were built to make it seem acceptable. Training schools for concubines, marriage contracts signed when a child was barely a teenager, secret houses where the young were kept out of sight until summoned. And these weren't isolated scandals. They were symptoms of a deeper belief that royalty was above the rules that governed everyone else. When you sit at the top of a hierarchy so steep, the people below you stop being seen as people at all. Most of these children never got to tell their own stories. The historical record erases them, their names lost, their faces missing from portraits, their lives reduced to footnotes in someone else's biography. We only know them through whispers in letters, fragments in court records, or the rare scandal that managed to break through official censorship. If history teaches us anything here, it's that power combined with secrecy creates the perfect conditions for abuse, and that the victims of such systems are often the easiest to silence. We look back at these rulers now with a mixture of fascination and horror. Their reigns are over, their palaces crumbling or turned into museums, but the patterns they set, the justifications they used, are still visible in different forms today. And maybe that's the real dark history. Not just what happened in the past, but how easily the same excuses can still be made when someone powerful wants something they should never have.